And that's what Jesus comes to offer us. Not a pathway, not a program of recovery, not an enlightenment journey. He comes to offer himself. Here's what you should have done. You haven't done it. You'll never do it. I came to do it for you. Now you need to trust me and what I've done for you. If your faith works for you, that's great. But don't push it on others. We've all probably heard this or some form of it, or maybe we've even thought this ourselves. Our world believes that religion should be private. You can talk about your workouts. You can talk about your diets. You can talk about your travel plans. You can even talk about your sex life. But don't talk about Jesus. That's too personal. And for some, it's even an offensive topic of conversation. But here's the deeper question. Why do Christians feel the need to share their faith at all? Why can't Christians just let people be? There is a magician group called Penn and Teller. And in this magician duo, Penn is the taller magician, and he's the one that does the talking. And he is an avowed atheist and has spoken about people who are Christians or other religions trying to evangelize or proselytize him. And this is what he said. I've always said I don't respect people who don't proselytize. I don't respect that at all. If you believe there is a heaven and hell and people could be going to hell or not getting eternal life or whatever, and you think it's not really worth telling them this because it would make it socially awkward, how much do you have to hate somebody not to proselytize? How much do you have to hate someone to believe everlasting life is possible and not tell them that? That's his response, probably not the most popular view of evangelism. But I think he's actually more on target, on topic with how the Bible would view this, of sharing our faith, of making our faith a public matter, not something that's just private and personal. But even with this idea, we have to be honest that some Christians have gone too far with evangelism. We think of evangelism and we can think of people being too pushy. People being tone deaf, people being overbearing. If I'm honest with you, I've been all three at some point in my Christian walk. But there's a tension. What if we're, as Christians, not just sharing opinions, but we're offering water to a world dying of thirst? You see, in the passage we've been looking at here for some weeks, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul is writing to a group of Christians in the ancient city of Corinth, and there was a man who had been involved in an incestuous relationship with a stepmother. And this man was a Christian. He was a member of that church there, and the church had done nothing about it. And Paul wrote them and said, look, you guys have taken tolerance too far. You have to confront this man within the church. You have to purge him. You have to remove him from the church until he repents. And we've looked at that 2 weeks ago. And we've also saw if we are not to do that with people outside the church, we're to judge those inside the church. We looked last week at how we do that biblically, because we recognize there is a way to judge other Christians that's actually sinful in itself, and we want to do it rightly. But that leaves us, well, if we're not to judge outsiders, what are we supposed to do with people who aren't Christians? If we're not to try to hold them to our ethical and moral standard, and we're not, what is our response? And in seeking to answer that question, right, we recognize, Paul says that God's going to judge those outsides. If that's not our responsibility, what are we to do? And I think that Jesus' own interaction in John chapter 4 with the woman at the well, and then the woman at the well's interaction with the village that she then seeks to evangelize, is a great insight for us to understand how did Jesus approach an outsider who was living a very sinful lifestyle. How did he approach her? And then how did she in turn then approach those fellow unbelievers who lived in her village. If we're not supposed to judge, and I'm going to argue we're not supposed to become Amish, as Paul says there in verse 9, I wrote to you my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, right? Or then you would have to go out of the world. So Paul's not calling us to judge them, and he's not calling for us to sort of shun them and not have any interaction with them. There is a middle ground. And I think we find insight into what that looks like by looking more closely at Jesus' interaction with the Samaritan woman there at the well in John chapter 4. As I said, we're not sharing opinions, but we're offering water to a world dying of thirst. Now, when I go outside and I get busy working in the yard, mowing grass, maybe working on some landscaping or whatever, and I get hot, I get sweaty, I get thirsty. The thing that I long for, the thing that I crave for, is an ice cold Mountain Dew. I don't smoke or chew, but I will drink a Mountain Dew, okay? Now, I know, before you send me a link here to an article, I know that what I need in that moment is water. But water doesn't taste as good as Mountain Dew. Not even close. And so I drink a Mountain Dew when I get hot right out of the refrigerator right there in the garage. Now, what I thirst for isn't what is actually best for me. And even though I have that knowledge, I go back to the Mountain Dew over and over again. And really that idea is what Jesus picks up on with the Samaritan woman here at the well. You see, everyone in our world is looking for satisfaction. People as human beings have desires, they have a thirst to live life to the fullest, to experience life as it should be. That is a God-given drive. We want to experience life as it ought to be experienced, to its fullest. But people seek that satisfaction in Mountain Dews. They seek to satisfy those thirsts in ways that actually aren't best for them. We can seek to satisfy our desires through sex, through careers, through wellness culture, through getting active in some political or social movement. We think if we just get that right, it'll click and life will make sense. Life will be what I think it ought to be. Social media tells us that we ought to find ourselves, our true selves. Success tells us you ought to earn your worth and find your value in the material goods that you possess or the recognition that you accomplish through climbing the ladder of your career. And romance is there saying you can find someone who will complete you, make you whole. Our world is dizzy with all these options that are thrown to us to give us a fulfilling life. But the reality is, as a society, we have more of those options than any people that have ever lived on the face of the planet, and we're not happier than people used to be. We're chronically anxious. We're constantly scrolling, and we're still thirsty when we meet our goals. And so we find out, well, still not enough. Maybe it's time for me to change my job. That new job will scratch the itch I'm after. Maybe it's time for me to find a new partner. That new partner will satisfy that thirst. Maybe I need to even change my gender. And I'll finally find that fulfillment that I know something's off in my life. We have many ways that we substitute Mountain Dew for God's living water. But no matter how many substitutes we look to, we're still thirsty. And this is exactly where Jesus finds the woman at the well. She comes to draw water at noon, the hottest part of the day. Now, verse 15, finally, she tells Jesus, she probably thinks he's a little bit crazy because she's talking to her. That's odd for that society. And so finally, she's like, what do I have to lose? Sir, give me this water that will never run out. Give it to me. Verse 15, so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water. So she finally commits and says, I want to know it. You've offered, you've convinced me, give me the water. And then Jesus, what it appears like is he seems like he's changed the subject. But instead he responds to her request for this water, and he says, let's talk about your sex life. Right? And he's not changing the subject because he's saying, you know this living water. This hunger, this thirst that you have in your life, you know that there's something out there that's going to complete you, that's going to fulfill you. You've been about that your entire life. And for you, this lady at the well, you've been trying to find that living water in relationships with men. That's why he says, go and call your husband, verse 16, and come here. The woman, verse 17, answered him, I have no husband. And Jesus said to her, you are right in saying I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true. Jesus says, this water that I'm offering, you've got an idea about it. You know life is missing something. There's something wrong about life, that it's not fulfilling as it should be, and you're trying to close the gap. You're trying to fill it up with something because you know something's wrong. And Jesus is right, you're right on that. But you've been looking to relationships with men to be the living water for your life, and it's left you empty. That's where she's at. She hasn't found, to quote Bono, what she's looking for, right? She's been chasing that same thirst that we find in our own lives. We may chase something else besides human relationships, but we're chasing living water. 5 husbands later, and she still has no peace. She's given up on happy ever after, but she still can't bear to be alone. And so here she comes to the well at noon, the hottest part of the day, because she's avoiding the judging eyes of her neighbors. The other women in the village would have come in the morning when it was cooler to get the water that they needed for the day. But she didn't want to be a part of that social chit-chat. So here she is, isolated, ashamed, and exhausted from trying to find living water in her human relationships. And here, in her place of isolation, in her place of exhaustion, in her place of shame, Jesus approaches her at the well. Because Jesus pursues outsiders with grace and truth. He doesn't avoid the awkward. He walks right up to her. And this is a shocking thing for her and for those watching. Notice in verse 9. The Samaritan woman said to Jesus, how is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Then in verse 27, the disciples had been sent away, and then they return back to Jesus and see Jesus interacting with this woman at the well. And it shocks them. Verse 27, just then the disciples came back. They marveled that he was talking with a woman. But no one said, what do you seek, or why are you talking with her? Right? Jesus is crossing social taboos. Right? He's committing social taboos here. He's crossing an ethnic barrier. A Jew is speaking to a Samaritan. This did not happen. Jews despised Samaritans. They were unclean, unholy people. Their politics were wrong, and their religion were wrong. So you just didn't talk to them. They're down on the rung of the social ladder. But Jesus crosses that barrier. He crosses the gender barriers. Here he is as a man speaking to a woman. This was not something that was done in this truly patriarchal society. It didn't happen. Another rabbi writing in this similar time frame made this comment. One should not talk with a woman on the street, certainly not with someone else's wife because of the gossip of men. It is forbidden to give any woman a greeting. So, not the Bible, right? But that was sort of rabbinical understanding in the time of Jesus. And again, the disciples are shocked, marveling that he's talking to a woman at the well. He crosses the gender barrier. But he also crosses moral barriers. Here he is as a righteous rabbi, a righteous teacher who is engaging with an adulterous outcast. This doesn't make sense. And he tells this woman in verse 10, if you knew the gift of God, you would have asked me, and I would have given to you living water. And this is a turning point because Jesus isn't here offering her a new religion. He is offering her a source of life. That living water, that life that she's been searching for, Jesus is saying, I've got access to that. I can give what you're after. She comes to the well for physical water, but Jesus is offering her a spiritual water, an eternal, soul-quenching, identity-changing grace that will change her life. And that's when he gets personal, as we've seen, when he tells her, go and call your husband. Jesus doesn't let the fact that this woman is of the wrong ethnic group, doesn't let the fact that she's a woman, he doesn't let the fact that she's an adulteress, she has a moral shadow over her life, keep him from pursuing her. He comes to her and he offers her grace, but he also addresses her with truth when he tells her to go call your husband. It feels abrupt, can even seem offensive on the surface, but as we've said, what I've said, he's not changing the subject. He's showing her that her attempts to satisfy her desire for life, they're wrong. The Bible would use the word, they're sinful. And because God loves us and he loves this woman, he's trying to help her to see your choices have been wrong. They've broken God's pattern for you. And look, it's hurt you. It's not met what you're after. And it's isolated you. It's burdened you with shame. And you're walking around in a place of spiritual exhaustion because of the wreckage that's left in your life. She was seeking love and approval and worth from men, and it didn't satisfy her because men were not designed to do that for her. Jesus exposes where she's been looking for wrong so that he can heal her where she'll look in the right place, namely at him. He approaches with truth not to shame her, but to save her. Now, eventually, as with most people, when you start getting this personal, right? Jesus is getting very personal in exposing her romantic past, right? So what does she do? She tries to change the subject, right? Getting uncomfortable, verse 19, the woman said to him, after she reveals, you're right in saying you don't have a husband, you've had 5 husbands, and the man that you're shacked up with right now, he's not your husband. So she responds, sir, I perceive that you're a prophet, right? That's a probably pretty good guess, right? And so as a result, she says, well, let's move off me. Let's talk politics and let's talk theology. So what does she bring up? Our fathers worshipped on this mountain there in Samaria. But you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. It's a worship war, right? Of course, for these people, religion was not separated from their politics. They were one and the same. And so Jesus, she's here deflecting. She doesn't want to talk about herself and the living water. She wants to get Jesus off on something else that's less personal. Where should we worship? And the reality is we do that too. When things get too personal for us, when people that we're talking with that are not Christians, the gospel gets very personal, it's not going to be surprising to you that they try to shift gears to some other topic. They'll get political, they'll get philosophical, they'll get theological, anything that gets it off of Christ dealing with their own heart. But Jesus stays with her and doesn't let her do what she's trying to do. And as Christians, when we're dealing with unbelievers, it's wise for us not to do that either. I can't tell you how many times it's crazy. Like people want to talk about evolution. They want to talk about the age of the earth. And I'm not getting into that. Let's talk about Jesus. Because only that is going to actually be saving you, not those other conversations. Not to say they're not important and don't have a place. But that's not what Jesus came to the world to talk about. Where to worship. Now, he does answer her question. He does say there, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. Right? You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. He does confirm the real temple is there in Jerusalem, but his point is it's actually not going to be there for much longer because the hour is coming when people aren't going to go to temples to worship. And every time in the Gospel of John, when Jesus employs this phrase, the hour is coming, it is always referring to his death. Jesus is saying, when I die, we're going to put an end to this. There won't be a temple in Samaria, a temple in Jerusalem. You will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, not in a physical temple. Jesus makes that clear. Jesus is saying that when I die, it will get rid of the reason for why we need temples. You won't need priests. You won't need sacrifices. You don't need temples because in the past, these priests and these sacrifices and these temples were there to bridge the gap between sinful, unholy people and a righteous, holy God. But when I die, I will be the ultimate sacrifice, serving as the greatest high priest, being the true temple of God, the place where God and his creation can meet and be reconciled. You see, this story here points forward to the cross. And we remember that one of the words that Jesus says when he's hanging on the cross is, I thirst. Now, of course, Jesus here is physically dehydrated in his crucifixion. But we know from the Scripture that there is more than physical suffering that's being experienced here. He was experiencing a spiritual dehydration. He was cast away from the Father's face. He was being cut off from the source of life, shriveling up under judgment, not for his own sin, but for our own. You see, we had sought satisfaction to our thirst in so many things in this world, and Jesus always satisfied his thirst from his Father. And on the cross, he was suffering in our place, so that he could say to this woman and to anyone with ears to hear, I don't care who you are, I don't care what you've done, I have living water for you. Will you humble yourself to recognize that your attempts to satisfy life have fallen flat? Will you stop that and look to me alone to satisfy your soul's longing? I can give you living water because I have experienced ultimate thirst. Jesus thirsted so that you will never have to thirst again. Now, how do we take this? How do we take it? The idea that we as Christians can't keep our faith private, that we're all thirsty, all of us are going after that Mountain Dew of the world. We know water's best. Christ is what's best for us, but we think these other things will sort of do what Christ is saying he alone can do. And we're thankful that Jesus pursues us as outsiders when we've done that. Jesus isn't afraid to come with us, to us while we got that can of Mountain Dew in our hand, right? To help us. And he does that because he is the God who thirsted so that we could be satisfied. And I think all of that sort of can help us as we think about this story and putting it together to help us as Christians to think about how do we take our faith publicly, how do we share our faith in a world full of people who don't agree with us. The reality is, the little spot in Newburgh, Alabama that I grew up in, most of the people there shared a very similar worldview. Most people thought the same about things. Small little disagreements. Auburn, Alabama football kind of things, but nothing too major, right? But that's not really the world that we currently live in. Most of our neighbors, family members, co-workers view the world very differently than we do as Christians. And so how we think about communicating our faith to them is very important. We know we're not to judge them according to Christian standards. God's going to do that. We know that we can't sort of just totally remove ourselves from them, sort of thinking that the Amish living is some kind of spiritual paradise. That's not what Paul says we're to do. So how do we live among them and share our faith with them? Well, I think a couple things here I want to glean from this story as we sort of wrap up together. Number one, I think we start with relationships. We start with relationships. Notice here that this woman, after Jesus shares these truths with her and offers her living water, reveals that he's the Messiah. Verse 28 says, "So the woman left her water jar and went away into town and said to the people, 'Come see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ?' They went out of the town and were coming to him." And then verse 39, "Many Samaritans from that town believed in Jesus because of the woman's testimony. 'He told me all that I ever did.' So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days, and many more believed because of his word. They said to the woman, 'It is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this indeed is the Savior of the world.'" So we find that this lady, when she becomes a Christian, right, she comes to a place of belief in Christ, that she shares with those in the village. She doesn't preach a sermon, right? She doesn't go out and get on some box and do some street preaching there or have to do that. That's not what she's doing. Again, don't say those things are necessarily wrong, but that's not the example we're given here. We're given an example of a woman with a checkered moral past who had a wrong religion, encounters Jesus, believes on him, and now she turns to those people that she knows, she has relationships with, and she shares with them about what Jesus has done in her life. And so for us as Christians, a lot of times we make evangelism and speaking of our faith to other people something like, well, how are we going to win the whole world? Man, that's not your responsibility, right? Think about the people that you know, and that's where we start with evangelism. People closest to us, our neighbors, our coworkers, our family members, classmates, friends on a sports team. These are the relationships God's given us, and that's what this lady does. We start with our relationships. We also lead with our story. That's what she does in verse 29. "Come see a man who told me all that I ever did." Verse 39, "He told me all that I ever did." This is sort of her testimony. She's relating her encounter with Jesus. And I think this is good news for us because what it's telling us is that to share our faith, to be public with our faith, we don't have to be apologists. We don't have to be like some YouTube apologist going to college campuses and answering everybody's questions, and we've got an answer for every question that anybody in the whole world could ever propose to us. That's not a burden here that we need to bear. She didn't memorize bullet points. She didn't need to publicly preach to anybody, right? The reality is what she did is much harder than those things. Because what she did is she laid bare her own life. She opened her own heart and her life, which was messy, which was embarrassing. There were places of shame. And she's like, Jesus told me all that I ever did. And he offered me living water. You see, we can't hide our heart from people if we're going to be effective evangelists. And we can't hide how Jesus has healed our heart. There's a vulnerability that this lady shows, and it disarms the village. It paves the way. You see, you're not going to be, you can share the gospel with 1,000 people, but if you do it as a project and people are kept at arm's distance and you're not transparent with people, you're not going to be effective in sharing your faith. We as a church will not be an effective evangelistic church. What we have to learn to do is help people to see the relevancy of Jesus and the gospel. Now, I know a lot of people get up in arms when people say we got to make the gospel relevant, and I don't use that language because I think it's precision of language, right? We're not making the gospel relevant or Jesus relevant. He is, but people don't see its relevancy. So we're helping people to see how relevant the gospel is for our life. And of course, we understand this idea of reconciling us to God, and that is a huge part of the gospel. But there's also seeing how that flows into transforming our daily life. The gospel doesn't just redeem our past and secure our future. The gospel is for all of life, right? It's here transforming our everyday experience. And when we talk about those things with people who aren't Christians and we show how Jesus weaves into that, that helps them see that this isn't just some pie-in-the-sky religion. It has real practical relevance to how we live our lives. So we can talk about our struggles and our problems, and we explain how Jesus helps us in that. That shows them that as Christians, we're not people who are perfectly put together, right? Everything's not perfect in our lives and everything's squared away. We have struggles, we have problems, we have failures. In many ways, unbelievers can be better at us in certain things than we are. But this is how Christ helps us deal with our problems. When we have to make decisions, we work through things and people are asking, well, how did you decide on that career? How did you decide to do this in your parenting, right? We don't short circuit and leave Jesus out of that. We explain how Christ has made a difference in how we make decisions about what we do. This is a very natural way of putting Jesus on the table. Now, we don't have to be a lifelong friend with someone to be open like this. But this transparency is moving our conversations beyond surface level interaction. And the reality is we have to be the people to take the risk at doing that, not other people. But this transparency, when we do it, is disarming. We don't hide how Jesus is involved in how we deal with our problems and struggles. We don't hide how Jesus helps us make decisions about our life. We don't hide how Jesus sets the priorities for our lives. And I don't know about you, but you do a quick search and you think about how to make decisions, how to set your priorities, how to deal with your problems. You look at what's Googled. Those three things are going to be probably in the top 5. Those are questions that your neighbors and your coworkers and your family members, they're asking. We're asking. The only difference is we're saying Jesus is going to help us through that. Now that means, A, we actually have to have a life centered on Jesus. Because if we're dealing with our problems and making our decisions and setting our priorities, and Jesus sort of somewhere on the shelf say, oh, that's a Sunday thing that we get out, but not every day of the week, then we're going to struggle to do that, right? And we have to be courageous enough that when we answer these questions, we'll actually weave Jesus into it and not leave him out, which is a temptation all of us face. We're going to bring our faith in a complex world. We start with relationships. We lead with our story. This is what let me tell you what Jesus does for me, all right? But then, of course, we don't want to be the hero of our story. We want to make Jesus the focus. We're going to make him the focus. Verse 29, right? In her testimony statement, come see a man who told me all that I ever did. All that I ever did, there's my personal story. Come see a man, right? Pointing to Jesus. What she's doing. Now, she knows very little about Jesus, which actually makes her the most effective evangelist. Most Christians get this confused. They hear someone who knows a lot about the Bible and a lot of theology, and they think, I can never share the gospel because I don't know all that person knows. I mean, you don't know the secret. The more someone's a Christian, the less effective they are as an evangelist because they learn too much. And they can't discern what information is actually more important than the other. So this lady didn't have all this theology, so she just goes and she shares a simple encounter with Jesus. She's not distracted by other theological kind of topics because she shares what saved her. That's important for us as a church. It's important for us as individual Christians to make sure that Jesus is the focus of our conversations, particularly with people who are not Christians. I'm not going to defend Donald Trump in a evangelistic conversation. So, I'll throw Donald Trump on the bus. I'll throw any politician on the bus when I'm trying to point an unbeliever to Christ because it's much more important. And that's the focus that we have to have. She knows little about Jesus, but she knows that he is central to her newfound faith. She doesn't go into the village and offer a pathway to find God. She doesn't offer some enlightenment journey that someone can go on. This is what the world religions offer to us, and unfortunately, people pervert Christianity and offer that to people. And they should reject that perversion. There's not a way. There's not steps. There's not 5 pillars. There's not an 8-fold path, right? Come see a man. Jesus, what's the way to God? Me. Jesus, where's truth? I am truth. I'm it. And that's what Jesus comes to offer us. Not a pathway, not a program of recovery, not an enlightenment journey. He comes to offer himself. Here's what you should have done. You haven't done it. You'll never do it. I came to do it for you. Now you need to trust me and what I've done for you. That's the message of the gospel. Not all those other things that often get mistaken for the Christian faith. Jesus didn't come to tell us what to do. He came to do for us what we couldn't do so that we could be reconciled to God. So we don't point to a philosophy. We don't point to a set of rules. We point to a person. We point to Jesus. And so our evangelism, our public faith is not how to get better. It's here's the one who loved me at my worst. He knew all that I've ever done, and he says, you're a perfect candidate for my living water. Will you receive it? This isn't a wage you can earn. This is a gift that you have to receive. So the only way you can't get it is your pride. You won't acknowledge you need it. Lastly, we cultivate humble competence. We have to have humility in sharing our faith. We don't want to be pushy. We don't want to be overbearing. We don't want to be judgmental. We don't want to be superior in sort of our approach to people. We want to have a humility about us. We have to remember that we have received a gift. Verse 9. How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? And Jesus answered her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Brothers and sisters, what we offer to others is not something we've achieved. It's not a medal we wear around our chest. Look how good I was that Jesus loved me. That's not Christianity. This is the one who told me all I've ever did. You can see every thought I've had, every statement I've made, and we play that on a video, people would want to stone every one of us. And Jesus looks at us and says, I've got a gift. Will you receive it? Can't work for it, you can't earn it, you don't deserve it, never will. You've got to swallow your pride and humbly receive it. And when we do that, it ought to create a humility in us when we communicate the gospel to others. We're thankful that it's a gift because we know we would have never received it otherwise. And to come to the truth when we know that we're not worthy of it makes us a people who can share the truth with others without hammering them with the truth. But we have to have a humble confidence. It's not only humility we need. Some are bold and brash a little bit. They need that humility. Others may be too much on the humility side and they lack confidence. They lack courage. Because if you're going to share Christ, there's a risk. You look at this lady, she goes back to the village, and you know she had to be thinking about this a little bit. She was already a social outcast. She didn't go get water with the other women in the village. So she should have had a thought, will these people actually listen to me, right? Here's this woman showing up. You're going to lecture us about the Messiah? I doubt it's a woman with 5 husbands and living with a man she's not married to. But she doesn't let that keep her from speaking. She has courage. She has competence because of what Christ has done to her. She also could have been worried that would have further knocked her down the social ladder, right? We all knew something was wrong with you, but now you're really crazy. Talking about this man, this Jew that's talking to a woman and a Samaritan? What in the world? That's not true. You've been drinking something else out of the well there. Could have worried that it would further isolate her from society than she already was. And we face the same fears. Sharing our faith with friends, with coworkers, with neighbors means we run the risk of being cut off from people. That's why we have to have confidence. We have to have a courage from the Lord. It means that people, perhaps in our workplace, that we need to vouch for us to climb up the promotion ladder. If we're open about our faith, they might be less hesitant to do that. Are we going to have the courage, the confidence to put Jesus on the table? It might mean that we're quietly left out of neighborhood gatherings. We were once involved, but now, put the faith on the table, we risk a social isolation. This lady had a humble confidence because of her encounter with the living water, and she was willing to risk those things. You see, Jesus doesn't care about your race, your past, your performance, or your failures. He offers living water himself. If you haven't received that, let me encourage you, trust Christ. Stop your striving and your scrolling and your efforts to try to meet your own desires. Christ alone can ultimately alone do that for you. But if you're a Christian, you've tasted that living water. So you need to ask yourself now, who is it in your life that is thirsty? Who's chasing after success but still empty when they find it? Who's overwhelmed with guilt and grief? Who needs someone to say, come see a man who's told me all I've ever did and has offered living water to me? Brothers and sisters, we're not called to argue or drag or push people into the family of God. We're called to invite them to meet Jesus. Come see a man who saw me at my worst and still loved me. Let's go tell them. Let's pray.